Welcome to The Homeless Conservative, a show about principled politics for exhausted citizens. I'm your host, Blake Fisher, and I'm a political junkie so that you don't necessarily have to be, although we welcome you if you are also a political junkie. I'm so sorry. I know how it feels. It's a weird year to be one, right? I know you have a lot of things competing for your attention, so I'm super glad you're spending some time with me. And today we're talking about, I think, a really important thing. I guess I always think something's important. I think I probably say that in every episode, right? But today we're diving into the complex issue of homelessness. It's been rising across the country since 2016, and then accelerants like the opioid crisis and COVID have only made the problem worse. I live near downtown, and so I kind of see the tip of the iceberg, so to speak, all around me, and it's impossible not to be sympathetic when I see like a family on the side of the street asking for food or money. But at the same time, and I assume most people feel this way, it's hard not to be angry when like a crazy screaming guy tries to get into my wife's car, which actually has happened. And so it's easy to feel helpless to solve this problem. I certainly do. I don't totally understand the nuance of everything. And so I thought I'd have my friend Adam Luck join me. He is the CEO of City Care here in Oklahoma City, which is an organization that, among other things, has a night shelter where people experiencing homelessness can stay for a night, or indefinitely, actually, with no barriers to entry. They can just show up. They don't need an ID. They don't have to be sober, and have a shelter to sleep in. Adam and I talk about the causes of homelessness and how cities, nonprofits, and citizens can work together to reduce it. And spoiler alert, it's really complicated and nuanced. But we love nuance here, so that's not a problem, right? You can check out the description for links mentioned in our conversation, and I will take one quick moment to preemptively ask you to share this conversation with a friend if you think they'd enjoy it. It really does help me a lot. All right, so here's my conversation with Adam. Thanks for coming on, Adam.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks.
Appreciate you being here.
Yeah.
I needed an expert because you do this, or you're involved in this very heavily for your job. And this is a complicated issue, obviously. There's a lot of nuance in it.
Yeah.
And it seems like one of those things that, unlike a lot of the issues in politics, I feel like no one has a great solution for. I feel like it's one of those things where a lot of things, like we were talking about before we started recording, people just get entrenched in whatever their viewpoint is. I don't feel like there's a real clear left-right sort of idea, like this is the way we do it. I think that it's, most people kind of go, I don't know. I mean, it seems, and it's also this weird thing where there are, obviously, I think everyone feels sorry for people who are experiencing homelessness, right? I don't know that there's many people that are just like, whatever. I would think now some people might be more harsh about it than others in the sense that like, I don't want them, defecating on my streets and stuff. And I think that, and it's weird though. It's a tricky thing. I feel like people are very, at first they're always hedging. They're always kind of like saying, well, I feel sorry for them, et cetera, but, and then comes the thing where it's like, but I don't like the tents on the street. Right. I don't like the person trying to get into my car when I'm driving by. And so it's one of those complicated issues, and it's obviously increased a little bit. I will put some graphics up on the screen. I mean, specifically, it seems to have risen starting in 2016. It seems like we had a dip for about a decade. It seems like it was going down, and then 2016 starts ramping back up. So this is pre even COVID. My sort of understanding, maybe anecdotally, was that COVID caused a lot of this, but it seems like it was already ticking up years before COVID and has continued to increase in most places. So I guess the first question is just, is there a reason that you know of that nationally it's been on an uptick since 2016?
Yeah, well, I mean, first, let's just say you're using the term expert very loosely.
Well,
I mean, I have worked at City Care here in Oklahoma City for 7 years now, which has been awesome. And we've had the opportunity to do a number of things. We've got a supportive communities program where we have 112 units of permanent supportive housing for people who are transitioning out of an experience of homelessness. That's all in the same neighborhood just west of downtown Oklahoma City. And we've been in that neighborhood for over 20 years. We also operate Oklahoma City's only low barrier night shelter. And we opened this facility in 2021, started working on it in 2018.
And that means basically you show up, you can come in. There's not.
Pretty much. You don't have to have an ID.
Yeah.
You don't have to be sober. You don't have to enroll in any kind of program. You can just come and stay for one night or as many nights as you need to. And we also operate something called Mobile Outreach and Engagement, which we call MO. It's a transportation program for folks who are staying at the night shelter or really any other shelter in Oklahoma City. And then we know, as your mom has been a long time partner and participant in Whiz Kids, we've overseen the Whiz Kids program for over 25 years here in Oklahoma City. And we partner with local churches to help them serve the school that's in their neighborhood. And we have 29 sites across Oklahoma City where we serve about 500 kids a week through that program. So all of that really started with the founders of City Care, Larry and Maisie Bross, in 1996. They were a couple in Oklahoma City, and they came pretty close to experiencing homelessness themselves in the late 80s, and came to this conclusion that were it not for the family and friends that they had in their life, that they might be in a more difficult situation. And so they really turned their heart towards the people that they were seeing on the streets of Oklahoma City. And so they were at the time going to City Church, which is now Frontline, down on 10th and Robinson, and started just serving a breakfast once a week. They were like, we can at least do that. You know, let's just start there. So they did that pancake breakfast every Thursday morning for years and invited their friends to come do that with them. And, you know, you can kind of imagine through that experience, got to know a lot of people who were living on the streets in and around their church, and got to a certain point where they were like, you know, we could probably help this person transition into housing if we had a place to move them into. And so they started City Care as a 501c3 to apply for some grants to provide supportive housing. So they started at a little apartment complex downtown, and then eventually bought the land where we built the Pershing Center, which is our 60 apartment units right off of General Pershing Boulevard in Villa.
Which is my secret way to get downtown from west.
Oh, yeah.
That now is much busier than it used to be.
Yes, it is.
It used to be my secret way that no one knew about.
Yeah.
But now more people know.
Yeah. So anyway, I mean, that's kind of the backstory. And then getting to answering your question. So in 2017, I started at City Care, and that same summer, this is just speaking locally. I don't really know nationally, but locally in Oklahoma City in 2017, we had the major providers of low barrier shelter beds decide to stop doing that.
Okay.
And they said, okay, if you're going to stay at one of our shelters now, you have to enroll in one of these programs. And they created some requirements to access those services. So every year in Oklahoma City and most major cities that receive federal funding for homelessness do something called a point in time count.
Yeah.
It's a 1-day census of the number of people living unsheltered and sheltered, but in shelter environments in your city. So the Homeless Alliance coordinates it here in Oklahoma City, and they'll get, you know, a couple hundred volunteers to go out and do that. I've done that a number of years, and you literally, you know, you can be on the outreach team where you go to the encampments all across Oklahoma City, and we'll go from like 3 a.m. to 8 or 9 a.m. And, you know, you can only count the people that agree to take a survey. So you could go into an encampment and there may be 30 people there, but only 3 people come out. So that's how many you can count. So we saw a pretty dramatic increase in 2017 in our point in time count. It was actually the greatest year over year percentage increase that we had ever seen since we started doing the point in time count in 2008.
Yeah.
And it was
that's when it started nationally, right? Like 2007, 2008, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then that was like a 42% increase from 2017 to 2018. And then we saw another 45% increase from 2019 to 2020. And we're still at, you know, pretty high level compared to where we were 10 years ago. So, you know, we're not really sure. I mean, those of us that were in the service provider community at the time could see, like, we were operating the Oklahoma City Day Shelter at the time in partnership with the Homeless Alliance. So anecdotally, we were seeing a lot more people. We were hearing the stories of what was happening on the streets at the time, and just knowing that we didn't have a place where people could stay overnight was causing that number to go up. And so that was the beginning for us as we explored what it might look like to open a night shelter. Eventually, the building right next to the Pershing Center, which is on the corner of Villa and General Pershing, came up for sale in 2018. And we were able to purchase that building shortly after that through the generosity of some of our partners, and then spent most of 2019 going through a design process and really digging in deep, like, what is the point of having a facility like this? So we did a national kind of literature review. We went and saw some of the best examples of low barrier night shelters in this part of the country, and then went through a design process in 2019 and 2020. And then we started construction in February of 2020, right before COVID hit, and then opened in April of 2021. So we've been open just over 3 years at this point. And so, yeah, I'm sure you'll have more questions, but that's kind of at least locally why I think we saw such a significant uptick, is because we went from having close to 800 of those beds in Oklahoma City to less than 50, just in a matter of a couple months. And really, so now the question is, how many beds do we need? And is that the best place to focus our energy and effort?
Right.
Because what we've seen a shift in lately is this recognition that if you locate all the emergency services someone might need at the entry point to the system, then we require them to fall all the way back to that step to get the help that they need. So really the point is like, all right, let's first of all acknowledge that this person is in this situation for a variety of reasons, maybe some of which I've never experienced in my life. So I don't pretend to know what it was like to get there, which means it's very hard to predict what it's going to be like to get out of that situation.
Right.
And our posture at City Care is really just like, we want to meet the person where they're at.
Yeah.
And we believe, we've been really inspired by Community First in Austin, which is an amazing program. And their founder, Alan Graham, wrote a great book called Welcome Homeless. And he talks a lot about how homelessness most often results from a profound and catastrophic loss of family.
Yeah.
And
because like you mentioned, most people are going to have a support system where you're not going to end up homeless because it couldn't happen to me. I've got too many family members. Even if I lost everything, I'm going to have a couch or bed somewhere at a relative's house or friend's house or neighbor or someone that would be able to get me through. But obviously that's not everyone. Exactly. And you would assume that most people don't have that support or they wouldn't be sleeping on a tent.
Right. And that's actually that's a great point. It's a good thought exercise too. I mean, really think about like how many layers of social and communal safety nets would you have to fall through?
Yeah.
To end up needing the services that we might offer at the night shelter. I think about for myself, how many, like you're saying, how many people know my phone number? How many people know where I live?
Yeah.
How many people who it wouldn't matter if it was something I did or didn't do. I mean, there are a group of people who would not quit on me.
Right.
It wouldn't matter.
Yeah.
They would just walk alongside me for as long as it took. They would support Sarah and my kids, and it wouldn't matter.
Yeah.
And it's really hard for me to think about everything that would have to happen for us to need something like that. So, and you're spot on. The reality is that some people have never had that in their life.
Right.
And maybe there's another group of people who did have it at one time.
And squandered it. I assume this is where mental illness or drug addiction comes into the picture for sure.
Exactly.
There's an understandable reason. We've certainly dealt with that in our family of close people, drug addicted, that at some point we had to cut off because it was like, we're enabling that. Mm-hmm. And at some point you might not know where they are or what they're doing because that happens.
Yeah.
And that's a tough situation, obviously. And I know that's contributing. It's like the numbers are weird on trying to figure out how much it's contributing versus becoming a problem after they're homeless. I think that's a tricky part, but
and so I think it's when you get to that point in this discussion, you can say, okay, am I more concerned about placing blame with the person for how they squandered that margin or why they don't have that margin? Or am I more concerned about restoring some sense of that margin?
Yeah.
So for us, we don't necessarily have the luxury every day of thinking about the root issues about why somebody ended up at the night shelter.
Yeah.
We're really focused on, at a basic level, restoring that margin in some way, even if we have to synthesize it by saying, hey, we don't have a couch for you to sleep on, but you can sleep on one of these bunks.
Yeah.
We don't have a fridge that you can use, but let us serve you a meal tonight.
Yeah.
You can use our address as you're filling out this form. All the things that I would ask somebody to do if I ended up in a situation like that, the folks that we get to serve at the night shelter don't have. That's what we're focused on. And so that's kind of our heart posture is, we're not as concerned about placing that blame as we are about figuring out how to bring them back into wholeness with themselves, with their community, and ultimately, we believe, with God.
Yeah.
And, tonight when we open the night shelter, probably the most important thing we're going to do is remind the folks that come to the door that they have value.
Yeah.
And when you end up at the doors of the night shelter, it's because you have been told no.
Yeah.
Over and over and over again. And many times the night shelter is one of the last open doors where somebody can come in and they can feel safe and they can feel welcomed and they can feel valued, not because of what they've done or not done, but because they inherently have value. And I think the road, a lot of times, in the people that I've been in relationship and community with over the years who have had that journey, remember very clearly when that turning point was. And it usually centered on somebody reminding them of their value.
Yeah.
And so, yes, there's these huge systemic questions about like, what are the root issues? How do we get to those root issues? What are the local, city, state, national level policies and programs that we should have in place to support people as they transition out of an experience like that?
And hopefully catch it before it happens, even potentially. Yeah.
And those are conversations worth having. We step into those conversations as subject matter experts and humbly offer our opinions and expertise where needed. But we also stand in this gap between, having those conversations and also welcoming in 140 people into the night shelter tonight.
Yeah.
And I think the challenge day to day for us is managing the tension between those two places.
You mentioned causes and stuff, and I think that you bring up a good point. It was like it's every individual is going to have a different story, and it's really hard to make. I'm sure it's impossible to make government level law decisions based on that, because there are a lot of different stories. But I mean, I would say, tell me if this is fair or not, that it breaks down into probably a few categories of, there's families that this happens to. Some of what I've read and seen and stuff is like, that's the easier problem to solve for. It's like someone loses their job. They like, it's more of there's some sort of event that happens and it's a family. So this is they're not totally isolated in the sense that they've got each other, but not maybe external family, or maybe they're they're immigrants, or they're just from another town even, and they don't have any support system other than that family unit. I would assume that's an easier problem to solve than drug addiction or mental illness or some of the other problems, just because that's a little bit more, okay, we can get you shelter. That's kind of priority number one. There's other local organizations that do like school for the kids and stuff, and that's great. And it seems like they're not a huge part of the number of the unsheltered people that are homeless, right?
Yes.
Is that fair to say?
Yes, it's certainly less common. It does happen. Like, we have 4 family suites at the night shelter, and we included that in the design because there wasn't a place at the time where a husband and wife or 2 partners could go with their kids. One, not have to prove that they were married. Yeah. You have to be able to prove that you're married. And then even if you can, mom and the kids go in one part of the building, dad goes in the other part of the building. They can't really interact while they're there. So we wanted to create a space where family units could come together without being asked to define what that looks like, where they could stay as long as they needed to while they went through that transition and figured out what was next for them. And, one side effect that we didn't really anticipate is how often all 4 of our family units are filled with single dads who have their kids. And this allows them to keep their kids. We've got a great partnership with DHS. They're with us pretty frequently, and, it allows them to be honest about the help they need without risking losing custody of their kids.
Right.
We've had moms come to us with kids that were pregnant that left to the hospital, had their baby, and DHS came to the night shelter and certified the family suite as a suitable living environment to bring the baby home to. And so, they got to stay with their baby instead of that baby entering state custody, so it's definitely less common, but it still is a very acute need. And you're right, it is much more situational. So we're able to really pinpoint what led to you having this experience. And it's oftentimes fewer number of things than an individual who may have lived on the streets of Oklahoma City for years. It may be a little bit easier for us to navigate that. There's typically more resources available for families as well, especially kids. I would say that safety net is probably a little bit stronger for them. And you're right, they've typically got a little bit more structure, a little bit more community, a little bit more margin in life.
Plus, I think people just inherently see a kid that's homeless, and it pulls on a different string than, or a family, or that it just it because that kid didn't do anything to, what I mean, generally.
Yeah, which is, I mean, and isn't that interesting that that's one of the reasons why our heart might be more gracious towards one person than we are towards another, is because of responsibility. And I think it's really interesting. And part of the opportunity of doing this work here in Oklahoma is to have conversations with people who do value personal responsibility. We've had the opportunity to be invested and work and live in the same neighborhood for 20 years through City Care, and it's in Oklahoma City, which has a vibrant business community and a lot of people who are interested in this issue. And as we've seen homelessness become more and more visible over the last 5 years, that conversation has risen to a level where if you're at all engaged in the community, like you're talking about it, people are talking about it.
Yeah.
And the opportunity for us has been really just to, with grace, meet people where they're at on both sides, whether you're a guest who comes and stays with us tonight, or you're somebody who owns a business in downtown Oklahoma City and has a lot of questions and ideas about why somebody ends up at the night shelter, and in turn what it means for them to not have to be there. Either way, we're going to meet you where you're at with grace, and we're going to be willing to have that conversation and acknowledge that we may not have all the answers, but we can at least talk about it and move forward on the spectrum of understanding about what it means to have this experience, and then in turn what it means to transition out of it. So it's different than doing this work in other parts of the country where you don't have to have conversations like that, where the political environment might be more open to or interested in the social and governmental response to this issue, as opposed to what I think we see sometimes here. But it ties back to this interesting opportunity that we have in a place like Oklahoma, where we do place a very high value on personal responsibility, and we also would say that we have a very high value on faith as well, and that's demonstrated through how many churches we have and how many people would prescribe to the Christian faith practice. And then we try to square all those things with, okay, well, how does that play out in our community?
Yeah.
When we look at the metrics by which we would judge how well a society is doing or whether or not it's flourishing, we would expect to see those things bear out in some way. In other words, that because we have so many Christians or so many members of the faith community and so many churches, that our communities reflect that reality.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes it doesn't, especially in Oklahoma. We find ourselves first in the things that we should be last in, and last in the things that we should be first in. And again, it leads to really wonderful opportunities to surface the tension that represents, and ask people, well, why do you think that is? And it gives us an opportunity to kind of open people's hearts and minds, to the reality that, folks may not share the same experiences that you've had. You may not understand exactly where they've come from, but we can all agree that it's okay to meet somebody where they're at with grace and just go from there.
I think that brings up a good point, because I was looking at just some of the stats, which I'm a data guy. Mm-hmm. I love looking at this kind of stuff. So Oklahoma has 9.4 per 10,000. This is 2022's number, so I don't know how updated they are. But then, California is like 43. Mm-hmm. Oregon 42, New York 37, mm-hmm. Vermont 43, Maine 32. That Maine number was kind of weird to me.
Yeah.
What do you think? I mean, California makes sense to me because it's a big state. The weather's perfect most of the time. Mm-hmm. I can see why it'd be easier mm-hmm. to live on the streets in California than it would be in Maine or New York. Mm-hmm. Do you have any idea why certain states is there some sort of like correlation between population where it's not just that percentage that change? It's like something about really big economies and big cities or states that have a lot of big cities. Because obviously this tends to be an urban problem more than it is rural.
Yeah, absolutely.
Obviously. So I would imagine the more big cities you have, so California, even though its population's really big, it also has a lot of big cities. It's not, whereas like New York is really just like one big city in the middle of the state.
Yeah.
So I don't know. Is there any kind of correlation or anything that where someone smart has gone, hey, this seems to be some sort of problem here?
Yeah. I think we're all kind of trying to still figure it out. I'm sure there are people out there with the answers. I think there's definitely a correlation between, the number of people and where the services are located.
Yeah.
Like you're just the people who, might live in rural Oklahoma who might have an experience like this, they're still there. They're still struggling. They're still trying to figure it out. But I do think to some extent you do see a higher concentration of people in places where there are services available, so then you get to this conversation where people are like, well, don't put the services here, and then you kind of start to spiral into that type of conversation.
And I think that's where there's a chicken and egg thing there, because like I mentioned with the drug addiction thing, there's a big fight I know sometimes on, was the drug addiction the cause for the homelessness, or was that the trigger that then they're on the streets and it's just easier to do drugs than it is to fix the problem or whatever the situation is. Obviously that's an individual thing. I would assume the rise in the opioid epidemic and then the fentanyl stuff has just exacerbated that problem in a major way.
Yeah.
So do you, what is I know there's not a silver bullet here for drug addiction. Obviously drug addiction is a gigantic problem outside of homelessness, even clearly. But it seems like to me when I see, because to me there's such a clear difference. Unfortunately, I moved downtown right around the same time that this uptick happened, which makes it I'm going to notice homelessness a lot more because it's all around me. It's for the most part totally harmless. People walk through the neighborhood all the time. But there's a difference between the person that is, outside and I can tell like, okay, this is someone that I need to have someone else with me. I'm not going to get in a car by myself with this person because I can tell they're not okay. And I don't know if it's drugs or mental illness, but I'm not going to, someone tried to like get into Elisa's car one time and was screaming and banging on her window and stuff. Like that's a different thing than the guy that's panhandling on the side of the road down the street. And I think most people can tell the difference about the safety thing. The problem is it's hard to know that until you interact with someone. So I can see why people are hesitant to interact with. It's like, like I think it's inappropriate for anyone to go up to my wife who's by herself pumping gas at 7-Eleven and ask for something just because I think that for the sake of her feeling safe, it's not okay for a guy to come up and ask her for something at a gas station. I would never do that. I know I'm not in the situation. So we get into this weird thing where I think people want to see it somewhere else. They're like, put the service somewhere else because everyone wants this to be solved, but not where they're at. Because there are parts of it that are eyesores. It's like, seeing someone peeing on the side of the road is not ideal to have to explain to my kids or whatever. But I also get there. So what is the solution, if there is one, for like specifically cities? Because this seems like a city thing. Obviously, we're in urban areas. I know there's all sorts of, we're making this even harder with the whole kind of police situation that's happened since 2020, in the sense that obviously police are generally not trained mental health professionals, but we're asking them to be the people that interact with this. So it seems just like bad ideas everywhere all around because some people are like, well, make it illegal to do that stuff. Well, then it's like, okay, well, now are we using the criminal justice system to solve this problem, which doesn't seem very apt to be able to do so. But then again, I'm also not pro just let people live in squalor because that's not kind either. I think that's my biggest problem with so many people that I would maybe I would categorize this as a left thing is saying like, it's basically saying it's unkind and like let them live the way they want to live. And I'm just like, no one wants to live drug addicted on the street. We've got like typhus, we've got diseases that didn't exist that are spreading in these communities and stuff. And it's not like, that's not okay either, just to let that happen. So other than, because I tend to agree. I think private sector and charities and things like that are better, and churches. I feel like all these people are better equipped to solve the personal problem than the government is. I just don't think the government can love you. It's not it's not its forte. But what are the things that cities and states can do or should do, or that in your dream world they would do?
Yeah, that's a good question.
That's a long-winded way to say it. But.
No, that's good. And I think we can look at a couple examples in Oklahoma City. So just by way of example, looking at the 9 shelter for the last 3 years. So in our first year, we had 2,300 unduplicated people walk through the doors of the 9 shelter. So our theory was, based on research and other cities our size, was that we were missing that first step someone might need to take in their transition out of homelessness. In other words, if you have to have an ID to access services that you need, if you have to commit to sobriety to get the help you need to address your substance use disorder or get on a stable medication regimen, where the question becomes like, where do you start? So that's kind of the whole point of a low barrier facility. So our theory was like, if based on the research, if people can have a place where they can go, where they can take that first step, most people are going to do that. And they're self-selecting. They're choosing to come to the 9 shelter. So in some way, it's different than the people who stay in encampments throughout the city who are saying like, this is where I'm at. I'm not accessing services, So it is a little bit of a self-selection, but we looked at that first year and we did the same thing in year 2. We're about to do the same thing in year 3, but we look at, of those unduplicated people, how many nights do they stay with us? So and for us, this is probably the most granular level of data analysis that we're going to be able to do, and it's hard to draw conclusions from that, but I think you can draw some. So we looked at the first group was like between 1 and 5 stays.
Okay.
For the whole year, and it was 53% of our guests had between 1 and 5 stays for the whole year. And it's interesting because a lot of folks, when they hear about a low barrier facility, the first question is, well, if you don't have any requirements for somebody to do something different, then aren't they just going to take advantage of what you're offering?
Right.
And I think that really gets to, for those of us who have not had an experience of homelessness, it gets to a commonly held misconception that people want to be there.
Right.
And for the most part, they don't.
Yeah.
They've gotten into this situation like we've talked about from a number of different avenues. And when the opportunity is there, they're going to take a next step, whatever that might look like for them.
Do you think the problem there is that the people that do choose it? Because, I mean, there are obviously a group of people that refuse any of the help. They don't go to the night shelter. They don't go to any of the other services. They don't want to get sober. They have no interest in that. Don't you think those are probably the most visible people for the public to see?
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. So that kind of gets to, well, I'll finish this point real quick. So the next group was 0 to 90 days, and it was 94% of our guests. That first year, and the second year it was 92%. And then the last group we looked at was who stayed with us every single night all year long. And it was 11 people that first year. So less than 0.5%. Yeah. Which is not what most people are surprised to hear that. And, you know, one of those gentlemen, again, it's just anecdotal, but you know, this is kind of what we tend to see, is that he'd been on the streets of Oklahoma City for over 10 years. And this was the first shelter environment that he'd been in. And it took us a year to get him to a point where he was ready to transition into housing.
Yeah, because it was what he'd known for 10 years at that point. This isn't, I just lost my job in my house.
Exactly. So, I mean, that's where we start to work through a lot of the things that we've talked about today, like mental illness, you know, substance use, you know, like reconciling with family. Yeah. You start to talk about, like, can this person work? If they can't work, what kind of fixed income could they be on? Yeah. You know, they may not even be at a point where they can live on their own. You know what I mean? So what we realized at the night shelter was, for the folks that came through the door, we thought we were kind of a part of a social and communal safety net. And we realized we were actually at ground zero after people had crashed through all those other social and communal safety nets.
Yeah, and that makes sense.
And we're kind of just doing what we can to pick up the pieces. But for the most part, people came, they stayed with us. For the majority of people, they stayed with us a few nights. Yeah. We got them connected to the services that they needed, and we never saw them again. Yeah. For the vast majority of the people, they stayed with us for a few weeks at a time. And it's hard to tell, is it a few weeks at different points throughout the year, or is it 3 months in a row? It's probably a combination of both. But again, 9 out of 10 people come, they get the help that they need, and we don't see them again. Now, getting to the question you just asked, you know, what about the people who are in encampments? They're not accessing services. So this gets to another example from Oklahoma City that we're starting to see nationally as well, which I think points to some potential solutions moving forward. So caveat here is, I think the solutions, as much as they vary from person to person, I think they also vary from city to city.
Oh, I'm totally sure about that. Yeah.
It can come down to a few common things. So it's going to have something to do with housing. Yeah. It's going to have something to do with services for people who are ready to access them.
And that's another thing that makes sense about California. The cost of living is much higher in all of those cities in California than they are in Oklahoma. Because that's one of the most interesting things, is that the richest state in the country by GDP, or however you want to measure it, is, or even, is California, which is really, I mean, it would be one of the richest countries in the world if it was a country. And then Mississippi is the poorest, but California has the highest and Mississippi has the lowest. So it's not just money, obviously, that we can throw at stuff. So so anyway, go on.
I mean, it is ultimately the affordability of housing. Yeah. But then also you have to think about the situation that somebody is in when they're transitioning out of homelessness, an experience of homelessness, or if they've been on the street for a number of years and they do finally get into an apartment. A lot of times we celebrate that threshold of the apartment as the finish line.
Yep, right. And it's not.
It's really not.
Which I think is the problem with there's obviously a bunch of people that just think housing first is the solution. And I feel like they say housing first, but what I think the actions really say housing first and last is the kind of, they think that's the solution to the problem. I think it's pretty clear that it's not. There was a program in Utah that kind of at first they thought this worked. And then I think as the years went by and they looked at the data better, they were like, it actually didn't. It didn't solve. Like we built all this stuff and it didn't solve the problem, even though we provided houses for, I think they got every person in a unit. But you're right, that's not getting to what caused the problem in the first place. It's probably not just that you didn't have a roof over your head. It's there's the familiar stuff. There's the drug addiction, there's mental illness, there's a job. What all the other things that you need to have. And so that's interesting to me that and we're spending, I think we spend between $30,000 and $50,000 per homeless person in the United States. Like if you just look at the total money we're spending. So it doesn't seem like it's just a money thing either, because for $50,000 a year,
right,
you could live in friggin' the penthouse. I mean, if you really wanted to. So is that where, so where do cities and states come in on that? I mean, is this laws that need to change? Is this services that need to change?
I'll kind of get back to what I was going to say about Oklahoma City. So we have in the last year started a partnership called the Key to Home Partnership. So you might have heard about it or seen it. If you pay attention to city level politics, you've certainly heard of it. So this has been several years in the making. You had Mayor Holt in 2019 put together a task force to focus on homelessness. So right away, one of the key ingredients when you see cities reach what's called functional zero in chronic homelessness. Chronic homelessness is defined as more than 12 months living in an area not fit for human habitation. Yeah. So you get to a point where you're at functional zero, which means you don't have anybody crossing that 1 year threshold. So you can get to functional zero in chronic homelessness and unsheltered homelessness, veteran homelessness, youth homelessness. Those are some of the common areas that we would measure. So there are several communities in the United States that have gotten to that point where, they know who those folks are. They focused for a few years, organized the resources they had, targeted them to where they created programs and identified the people and transitioned them out of that experience of homelessness while also keeping people from entering. So that's how you get to, functional zero and homelessness. So there's a great website that's called the Built for Zero Coalition. Some really great case studies on those communities that have been able to do that and some good research there. But all that to say, a prerequisite for having that kind of success and experience is alignment between the service provider community, the philanthropic community, and city government. So I think David Holt was a big part of, along with the philanthropic community, really brainstorming how to make progress on this issue back in 2018, 2019. Again, we were seeing the point in time count numbers. We were seeing numbers go up. You're looking at the coast saying, gosh, we're probably still on the front end of being someplace like that, but how do we keep from becoming like that?
Because it's obviously a lot easier to solve before it's overwhelming as a problem, because like LA is just in a totally different level of problem than most cities in the country are.
Right. Yeah. You hear people talk about it being manageable.
Yeah.
To the extent that it can be. We're at a point where per capita, we can probably wrap our hands around this and figure it out. So we had the Mayor's Task Force on Homelessness for a couple of years, came out of that still trying to figure out how to bring some of those ideas down to the tactical level to actually implement and get done. We had a consulting group that had some experience working in Houston and other major cities that had focused their efforts on a process called encampment decommissioning. So they came in 2021, started working with the service provider community, the CEOs, program directors, frontline staff, started kind of convening the philanthropic community in Oklahoma City, and also working with the city government. So this is the first time in a long time that we've had the kind of alignment that we have right now, where you have, again, the city government, foundations and philanthropists, and the service providers all pulling on the same rope in the same direction at the same time.
Yeah.
And if you don't have that, it's really hard to make progress on major social issues.
Because then you're fighting each other.
Right.
Yeah, it's like you need help.
Right.
Because obviously you can't do the stuff the city can do. The city can't do the stuff you can do.
Right. Or at best, you're just not focused.
Yeah.
You're not all focused on the same thing at the same time.
Because I think I've seen a video on Houston stuff. Because Houston, I know Houston has not solved it, but like they've done a lot better than some of the other cities. I think San Diego's another one that's done, like their numbers have gone down while every other city in California has gone up. And I know they had two different kind of solutions, and I don't feel like there's probably any solution that works for like Houston and San Diego are just different cities. Yeah. So there's probably, you can look at what works in another city, but not in their city. But what happened in Houston specifically that helped so much there?
Yeah. So, I mean, they started with this alignment that was created. They had a group that came in that helped them organize and have the conversations. I think that, again, have to be a prerequisite to deciding how the community is going to focus scarce resources and energy and attention on a very big issue. And that, I think that facilitation is also really key. A really key part of it is getting everybody on the same page, in the same room for a period of time, 6-8 months to a year to talk about it. And I know a lot of times we're kind of jaded and we think, oh, that's just going to end up with some strategic plan sitting on a shelf somewhere. I think a lot of us tried to hold those thoughts at bay as we engaged in good faith in this process. But, we saw some actual measurable progress. We felt like there was, if nothing else, I mean, to me, again, like seeing all those people in the same room talking about the same things was a big deal. So we did a couple pilots, encampments in Oklahoma City in 2022, and then we started the project in earnest in 2023. So we're about to wrap up actually our first year of this partnership. And the goal was in 2 years to house 500 individuals off of the streets of Oklahoma City, which would represent a 75% reduction in unsheltered homelessness in Oklahoma City.
Yeah.
So I think it was, as of last week, we were at 126 of that goal. Obviously, the first part of the project has been a ramp up, so we've kind of gotten to scale at this point and expect to keep operating at the pace that we're operating at now. And, for those of us that have been in and around this project for the last year and a half, know that it hasn't been without its difficulty.
Oh, I'm sure.
It's been very difficult. But at the same time, I think we can all appreciate the level of coordination and communication and effort that didn't really exist for a long time before we started this project together. So it's a $14 million project. They've raised half of that money from the private sector. They completely revamped what's called the Continuum of Care Board, is the main governing body for federal funds as it relates to homelessness in Oklahoma City. Went from 5 or 6 people that had been on it for a while to, I think they have 16 people on it now. And it's people who are in specific positions. So the CEO of the Oklahoma City Housing Authority, that's like a standard position. Doesn't matter who that person is. If you're the CEO of the Oklahoma City Housing Authority, you're on this board. Okay. Then they have some at-large positions. My point in mentioning that is, that change took a long time to make, but I think it came from an understanding that for the change they were creating to be sustainable long-term, they had to bring a local vehicle for that change into being. It can't just be consultants coming in and saying, here's what I think you should do. Now go do it for the next 5 years. So to me, that's a big deal that they changed the composition of that board. I think seeing the kind of investment and buy-in from the philanthropic community and private sector here in Oklahoma City is, again, it's a big deal. You don't see that all the time. And getting this partnership off the ground, as difficult as it's been, and, some of our team, we were just talking about it this morning, it's difficult work. You're going into an encampment. You're spending a couple weeks getting to know the folks who are there. And again, it's people who have been there for a while.
A long time.
For the most part. And they're not accessing services, but it's going in, it's starting with, at least for our teams, and I think most of the service providers that are a part of this project would say the same thing, but it's starting with relationship, getting to know the folks and spending time with them. They don't know that we're there to offer housing. So we're there getting a sense of who's there on a regular basis. And then once we identify the next set of encampments that we're going to offer housing to, once the housing is ready, then we go to them and we say, hey, we're ready to move you into housing this week. We've got your documents all in place. We've got the apartment unit lined up. And if you're ready, we're ready to move you in this week. And so then we move them in. And so
is there resistance ever at that point? I mean, or because you've been there, I mean, I know this is anecdotal and it's one-off kind of situations, but are there, because I assume if someone's on the street for that long period of time, they've, I don't want to say chosen to do so, but I mean, obviously if they're not accessing services, there is some level of them going like a little bit, they're a little entrenched in that, at least.
Yeah.
Have you found it's hard for them to sometimes change that? I mean, you hear about this with even people that come out of prison. It's almost like you've heard interviews with people that are like, I wanted to go back to prison because you got so used to that and it seems similar in some sort of way where it's like, this is not a good thing, but for some reason they're just entrenched in it.
Yeah. And again, it's hard to say because it's not an experience that I've had, but it's people that I've known and cared about and been in community with who would describe it both as a place they had been resigned to being and a place that they felt the world had taught them they belonged.
Okay. Yeah.
And sure, there are probably people who would just prefer it.
Yeah. Which is probably not very, I mean, that's got to be a small minority.
I mean, I don't know anybody, and again, it's not a huge sample size of people that I've been in relationship with, but, I don't know anybody who, after having transitioned out of that experience,
wants to go back.
Really does want to go back or says, I really enjoyed that.
Yeah.
They look at the wholeness they're experiencing now, and with time and healing and perspective can see how they ended up there, how they ended up staying there for so long, and also can recognize that it's a good and positive thing that they're not there anymore.
Right.
The challenge is folks don't have that perspective yet when they're there.
When you're in the fog of it, I'm sure you can't, you got to get out of that before you can really recognize what you were in.
Right. And we're in a position where we're not making people do something. We're offering it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, our experience so far has been most people are excited about it.
Right.
They're apprehensive, understandably, but they are open to it and they do say yes. You do have people who don't want it and are interested, but I mean, our experience so far has been probably 90% of people are saying yes, we want to do that. And it's, I think part of it for us as an organization, that success rate might come from prioritizing putting people in positions who are going out to those encampments who have that experience.
Yeah, because I assume that's just going to be an immediately barrier that is moved away where it's like, this was me.
Yes. Yeah.
Which is, I think, the same for addiction and all sorts of things like that. And criminal justice, all these things where it's like, just makes more sense when someone gets to come in and go, yeah, I was you. Not exactly. Obviously, everyone's story is different, but it does seem like that's a necessary part of the equation.
Yeah. And even without having to be so open about it or starting from that point.
Right.
You don't even have to say it. I think just being able to sense from someone their openness and their heart and the way they care, that they're not just there to check a box. They're coming out over a period of weeks every single day. They know your name.
Yeah.
They remember what you told them about you last week. They remember what kind of snacks you said you liked.
Yeah.
They remembered that you had an appointment and they showed up today to take you to your appointment like they said they would.
Yeah.
That kind of stuff over a period of time builds up trust, and that trust opens the door to relationship.
Right.
Which again, we coming back to where we started this conversation is really where it all has to come back to, because without that, we can't really take those steps.
Right. And a lot of them are sorely missing that relationship aspect, other than maybe the people they're in that camp with. But that might be it, because they don't have the familial stuff. They don't have friends. They don't have, they wouldn't be there in the first place.
Yeah. Yeah. So all that to say, that's a process that's been going on for almost a year at this point. We're coming up on the year mark in June. We'll be doing it for another year. So time will tell, how successful we've been at that. We'll do the point in time count again in January of next year. We'll get those numbers out summer of 2025. So, it may be some time before we're really able to really measure what the success of this project has been. But again, to me, I'm less concerned about seeing a dramatic drop in numbers over the course of 2 years than I am about seeing the kind of alignment and collaboration get started that we know we're going to need for the long haul.
Yeah.
To not just address it for today and get it out of sight and out of mind, but to put in place the kind of solutions that are going to address the root issues of why people are experiencing homelessness in Oklahoma City.
And with the right solutions, hopefully what you're doing is preventing people from getting into that long-term thing with the gatekeeping of the night shelter and things like that, where people are coming in, spending a few nights, you're getting them the services they need, and they may never end up being those people that are on the street for 90 days, a year, whatever the situations are. And if you can slowly get the people that are in encampments and have been there for a long time, that's obviously much harder work, but hopefully you can keep that revolving door from, you're never going to solve homelessness. It's not possible to solve it completely, because you're going to have people that lose jobs or lose their house or tornado hits or fire. I mean, there's all sorts of situations that can happen. They can get you in that situation, but it's then having a solution for them specifically. And if we can do that, then you can solve the long-term part of it. There's the Ninth Circuit Court had the ruling that basically said you can't, it's under 8th Amendment, you can't tear down, you can't tell people they can't sleep somewhere if you don't have basically a shelter that they could go to otherwise. Sorry, I dropped my phone. And then that's being considered the Supreme Court, essentially. Is that actually legal? Is it not? Because I assume that's actually, I don't know where we land on this, but I mean, I assume obviously some cities want to say you can't do that. It seems like San Diego is one of the cities that basically said we're going to make it illegal, but we're also going to make sure we build these really big facilities where you can come in, you can have your stuff, you can. It looks similar. Night shelter is in the sense that they have storage, they have things like that. That you, as someone that's never experienced that, never even thought about it, it's like, oh yeah, we've got a place to put your stuff. You can. But it seems like San Diego kind of did both those things. They said, well, we're going to provide the beds. And then we're going to say, you can't sleep out here, but we're going to give you a place to sleep. And if you say no, we're going to say, sorry. So is that part of a solution? Do you think that helps if cities do that? I mean, obviously that's where a municipality would actually be like building that themselves and not relying on philanthropy or something to do so. But does this help? Does it not? That's because some people are just like, make it illegal, kick them off. I mean, I've heard creative solutions to this to be like, if you want to sleep in a tent, if that's what you want to do, this is the area you can do it. That doesn't seem to have worked really well in places like LA, where it's kind of like, oh, we'll just move it out of the place where everyone can see it. Doesn't seem like it solves the problem. Seems like those places just get worse and worse and worse. So I don't know. I don't know what the question is here other than, is that something that is, I mean, obviously that's going to come down at some point, and you would think that municipalities are going to react to it depending on which way it goes. And I just wonder if there's a way that you think is the wiser way to do it for cities that you've seen. I know everyone's going to be different, of course. Yeah. Again, I feel like I'm not giving like really good answers here because it's you're doing great.
It really does depend so much. But I mean, again, I can speak from our experience at the night shelter. So when we opened, we were in the unique position of opening a night shelter in a neighborhood where we were the majority property owner. Yeah. So we were opening a night shelter next to an apartment complex that we owned. Yeah. And granted,
so you are the neighbors.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And granted, those folks have for the most part, most of them have the experience of transitioning from an experience like that. So it's a little bit different for them. I think maybe they were a little bit more open and supportive of the idea than maybe a traditional apartment complex might have been. But we also had good relationships with the businesses in the neighborhood, and we just had a vested interest in continuing to see that the neighborhood continued its trajectory that it was on after we've been there for 20 years. So we pretty quickly had people who were staying in tents outside the night shelter. One of the reasons is it's difficult for people who have mobility issues to get over to the day shelter. Yeah, it's less than a mile away. From the night shelter, and we still had people who physically couldn't get over there. Yeah, we anticipated that as we did site visits, and we're looking at how to design and build the night shelter. We knew that transportation was going to be a key, but we weren't able to get it started right away. So we knew we were going to have to come up with some kind of solution in between when we opened and when we would eventually get transportation going. So what we realized was, if someone's staying in a tent outside the night shelter, they are actually self-identifying as one of our highest need clients. Right. So that means that they physically can't make it to the day shelter, or they aren't accessing services anywhere else, and they're basically just waiting for us to open up again later that day. Right. At 6:00 for them to come in. And again, we're open at night, so we're making referrals, but we're not able to take somebody directly over there. Yeah. There's not a lot of that work that can happen. There's some that does happen. We've got a great team of housing navigators and advocates at the night shelter who work with folks every single night. But the reality is we're open at night when most things are closed. Yeah. So we started focusing the first couple hours of the advocates shift when they started at the night shelter spending time with the people who were in the tents outside. And so we basically said, like, hey, you're on city property. This isn't even on our property. They're in the median outside the night shelter. And, we don't want you to stay here. It's not the best place for you. So I'm going to check in on you a couple times today. I'm going to check on you tomorrow. Let's figure out what the next step is for you. So in our mind, you're signaling to us that you need as much possible support as we can offer. So I think this is kind of where you fall in the middle between these two answers of like, well, you can't do it here.
Yeah.
Then the question becomes, well, where can they go?
Yeah.
And if we criminalize it, more often than not, all we're doing is compounding the already existing issues that are making it difficult for them to find housing.
Yeah.
So what are we really trying to do? What's the root thing that we're really trying to do? If the root thing we're trying to address is, I don't like looking at you, then yes, putting them in the county jail is a great way to solve that.
Yeah.
Or writing them a ticket and bulldozing their stuff is a great way to do that. You're going to accomplish the thing you want, which is, I don't want to look at you.
Right.
If the thing that we really want to accomplish is, I care about you and I want you to have the best possible opportunity to flourish in my city, in our city, then the response is going to be different than that.
Yeah.
Again, I know that this is very nuanced. I know that,
but that's what it is. It is nuanced.
Yeah.
I mean, it has to be.
And I've had the opportunity to sit down with people who are business owners, who are property owners, who are people who are very frustrated and who
I totally get it.
Lost and feel like nothing's happening. Feel like there's no, they've had predominantly negative experiences with people experiencing homelessness that, for whatever reason. And my posture has always been, hey, I would love to have that conversation with you.
Yeah.
Would you be willing to come spend some time at the night shelter? Can we walk around? Can we go get coffee? And almost every single time, 9 times out of 10, that conversation ends up going in a really positive direction. Because at the end of the day, that person cares. They care enough to be frustrated about it.
Right.
And I think, like you and I were talking before we started recording, the way we've been taught in the last 10 years to have conversations about politics,
it's not great,
or difficult issues, is that we're just going to scream at each other.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to have any grace for you. I'm not going to try to think about where you're coming from or why you hurt the way that you do. And I'm going to be fine with screaming in your face and leaving you where you're at.
Yeah. Which is normally just online. It's not even in people's face.
Right.
Honestly, it's just really, people yelling behind the safety of their phone.
Yeah. And if we do get face to face at the first opportunity, I'm going to respond at the same level of intensity that you're going to respond.
Right.
And so our posture and even how we interact in the community and have these conversations is always just to be open and meet people where they're at, not shy away from difficult or challenging conversations. Try to as much as possible when we have the opportunity to have a long form conversation like this, dive into the nuance of the issue, but also come away acknowledging that we aren't going to solve this. I think that's a temptation for nonprofits, is to say, and even the ecosystem that we've been trained to try to thrive in incentivizes us to say, we're going to solve it.
Yeah.
If you give us money, we will solve this issue for you.
Yeah.
And if you do, you'll feel better about it.
Yeah.
And you don't have to think about it anymore.
There's also a weird thing that happens there where I think there are probably some organizations that are, I don't think this happens as much with homelessness, but there is some degree of, you look at the money that's getting dumped into like Los Angeles, and it just gets worse and worse and worse. And at some point you go like, they're not like you're seeing marked improvement. You're seeing, but to me, if organizations aren't seeing marked improvement, like it's like time to change the strategy, or it does seem like there's an entrenchment of some of those nonprofits too, that go like, I'm solving the problem, throw money our way. But really it's like, is this just money flowing through stuff? Cause it does, I don't, when you look at the trends, like I said, you got to look city by city, you got to look all that kind of stuff. But some of them are just continuing to go up despite astronomical spending on it. And you just go like, obviously, whatever you're doing is not working. And then you look at somewhere like Houston or San Diego or some of these cities, they're actually making really marked improvement right next door. I say next door in the sense that like Houston's closer to Austin. But, how do you is there a good amount of that goes on as far as, organizations that look at, oh, well, look what's working in Houston, or is there some of that political same kind of thing, that dynamic of, well, this is where we're at. We think it's like we almost can't admit we're wrong about what we thought would work. Is that a problem in some of these cities that you think maybe is happening?
Yeah, I think it's hard. I think people who have been, career public servants or spent a lot of time in the nonprofit sector, or have been, philanthropists or in the philanthropic community for a long time, you do get entrenched.
Yeah.
And you get jaded. You hear promises, you see people not follow through, and you just get the sense that, and even I think sometimes we hear people in faith communities talk about, well, this is just how it's always going to be.
Right.
And so, we get to a position where we're like, okay, but also, there can be examples of how this looks different.
Well, and if something was like this for forever, then okay. Like if there's a baseline of whatever bad thing is going to happen, this happens with all sorts of stuff. And some of it is, unfortunately, there's probably going to be a certain number of people that die in car wrecks every year. If we, it's like, I would love to get that number to zero. I'm not sure if it's possible, but like if we see it increasing significantly, I would hope that we would go, okay, something is going on though. Yeah. And so when you look at that trend from 2016, where it was dipping from 2007 to 2016, and now it's been raising up, and we're basically almost at those 2007 levels again, if not higher in certain places. Yeah. Well, you've got to go like, well, it's obviously not just like this all the time. Yeah. This is increased markedly, which means we should be able to decrease it again too.
Well, and this is where you kind of get in a weird spot where if you as a nonprofit have said, I'm going to solve this issue for you, you've really lost and given up any ability to speak objectively about the problem.
Yeah.
Because inherently you're saying, I haven't solved it.
Yeah.
And so that is a difficult spot to be in. And so that's why we've tried to be really clear that this is a community issue.
Yeah.
And it deserves a community response.
Yeah.
And yes, we are one part of that. We're going to be a subject matter expert, and we're going to step in and help where we can, but we're also going to use that role to bring people together, to bring to bear on this issue, whatever it is that you have. It could just be time. It could be friendship. It could be financial resources. It could be expertise. It could be any number of things, but it's going to take a community response to solve these things. And I feel like that allows us to remain objective and still talk about where the issues remain.
Yeah.
Instead of saying, no, it's fine, it's getting better, when in reality it's really not. We still have a lot of work ahead of us. And I think that helps people not get to a point where they've absolved themselves of any engagement or responsibility in how our city responds to people who are living on our streets.
Yeah.
And again, when you look at communities historically, even from a faith perspective, like, Christian communities made a difference when they did things no one else would do.
Yeah.
That's the historical influence of the Christian church. It had nothing to do with influence through elected leadership. It was taking care of the people on the margins. It was taking care of the sick and the orphans and the widows. And I think in some ways we've lost that a little bit. And I know a lot of us are really trying to recover that and do that in as genuine and authentic ways as we can. But even still realizing the limitations of that, even through the night shelter. It's like, man, I believe we have the most talented, committed, compassionate people at the night shelter who are doing this work in the city. But at the end of the day, we're still synthesizing that margin.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It's still not, if we have somebody that comes and stays with us for 3 months and then they don't show up tomorrow night, we're probably going to notice.
Yeah.
But are we going to go looking for them?
Right.
And, this ties back to what we started talking about, which is that, Community First in Austin, they talk about homelessness resulting from a profound catastrophic loss in family. And so housing is not necessarily going to solve homelessness, but community will.
Yeah.
And we heard community described at the Pershing Center in our little bubble of community, that true community is when anyone can go missing and everyone notices.
Yep.
And that, to me, has led us to this acknowledgement that even as good as we're doing, it doesn't get to the root of the issue. The night shelter isn't going to, night shelter beds aren't going to be the response that changes homelessness in Oklahoma City.
Right.
Housing will be a part of that. The night shelter will be a part of that. but ultimately I think it's going to be relationship and community and margin and all those things.
Which the government can't do either, for sure. Like I said, the government can't love you.
Mm-hmm.
And if that's the root of a problem, it's going to take individuals and groups of those individuals.
Right. Which in turn becomes structures and programs. And like, yes, you can see how that trajectory gets from the individual level of addressing someone's problem or the reasons why they led to an experience of homelessness. You can see how that extrapolates out to, okay, well, what are the systems and structures that we have to have in place to address this at a city or a state level? But you can also start to see where there's limitations to extrapolating that all the way out to a national policy.
Right.
So that's where you get into the nuance of it. And I just say, I feel like we're making progress here in our city. I think that more and more people are aware of it. More and more people express an interest in it. And they may come to that interest from a variety of different perspectives and reasons why they care about it, but at least they care about it as we're talking about it. And we're seeing more and more people come together to actually work on it. And that to me brings me hope, and at the end of the day, and this is another thing we talk about is like, at the end of the day, I have the benefit of getting to see these remarkable stories of transformation. And I think if other people could see and know some of the people that I've gotten to know in my life through this experience, that they would have the same kind of hope that I do, that that people can change, that these stories can have a different ending. And we get to see that day in and day out, which I think brings us the hope that long term it can be different. The city can look different.
And most people don't get to see that because they see the same person that's been homeless for 10 years or whatever in those encampments. I mean, because that is the most visible thing. They're not seeing the people that are going to the night shelter. They're not seeing most people don't see those stories happen. When it comes to the mental illness and drug addiction part, because the numbers are wild on that. I mean, they're like, some of them are saying it's like 30%. Some say it's like 80%. It's kind of all over the place. But I mean, it's clearly a component on mental illness and drug addiction. That seems like it's a whole different tricky thing, right? Because if someone's severely mentally ill, like I said, some of the people I've had interactions with have been like, this guy, if you would have spoken Spanish, you would have thought we were two normal people having a conversation. But this guy was telling me Bart Simpson was his grandpa. And like, he was speaking normally. It's not like he was screaming, but everything he was saying was totally crazy.
Yeah.
And that's one of those things that obviously there's no amount of reason that I'm going to be able to go like, oh, what do you need? I mean, because he's not able to do that. That seems like something that we obviously just the pendulum swung way too far when we just said, well, we're going to shut down all the mental institutions. Right. You can't involuntary commit someone. And it seems like we have just resorted to saying someone has to do something violent for us to be able to arrest them, to force them to get care. Right. And that seems like, and this is like, fairly close. This is one of Elise's aunt's sister. This is a weird thing. It's like married in, but her son murdered her because he was mentally ill and she was scared of him. But the fact that we didn't have any way to say, okay, this guy's clearly mentally disturbed and we don't have a way to force him to get help. Because I would think that in some of the situations with drug addiction or mental illness, you may have to at least force them to get sober enough to realize they need to get help or something.
Yeah.
That seems like a totally different problem to solve. And it seems like there has to be a legal thing because of the way we've set up that system currently, in the sense that I can't make you go to I can't make you take medication. I can't make you do stuff. Is there anyone that's doing that well? Is there something in the city that's doing that well nationally, something that helps with that thing? It just seems like and those are probably also the people that people see the most often. So I'd imagine if you're mentally ill, it's probably much easier to be like, I'm fine with living on the street than it would be for someone that has their faculties, right?
Yep. Yeah, well, I think you're right. I think we've seen a generational shift away from those institutions. And I think what we're seeing today is the result of that, where really the only entry point back into that care is through the criminal justice system.
Which does not seem equipped to do it in most ways. In some ways, yes. But I've got a cousin that's in prison because he's bipolar, and when he doesn't take his medication, he does stupid stuff.
Right.
And he did enough of those stupid things that finally a judge threw the book at him. And now he's in prison taking his medication, and he's great, but that doesn't help you get out of prison kind of thing. And it's just not it just doesn't seem like the right way to do it. And he would say that he's much better off than he was before, but he doesn't want to be in prison anymore.
Yeah.
And realizes that if I take my medication, and he's always had these up and downs, and you hear that story all the time with people. Yeah. And it's one of those situations where same thing. It's like none of us knew where he was at some points, right. Even though he had family that, but although he certainly burned bridges with some of them and stuff, but we just didn't know where he was and stuff. But that doesn't seem like the right system, obviously.
Yeah, I mean, especially we consider situations where somebody may not get to a point in the criminal justice system where they're getting the care that they need.
Right.
Especially at the county jail level.
Yeah.
I mean, in Oklahoma County, it's not a good place to land.
No.
And if you're pre-trial and you're trying to hold on to your public defender and you're trying to figure stuff out, I mean, it is just not a place to be. You are not going to come out of that interaction with that system in a better place.
And I think that also, I mean, we could have an entire other conversation about the criminal justice system and how I think it should be, the goal should be to change people.
Yeah.
I mean, some people just need to be thrown away. And I mean, like if you murder your whole family, yeah, we can put you in jail for forever. That's fine. I don't think, or, certain rape thing. There's some things that it's just like, I don't think you are getting better for this, but most things are not like that. Most things are, we want to see you. I mean, there's a whole thing there of like, we want to see you get better. We want to see you not be a criminal anymore, but that doesn't seem to be the goal. It seems like the goal again is like, we just don't want to see you anymore
right now. Yeah. At this moment. Yeah. And again, the hope of the justice system as well would be wholeness. What is the path back to wholeness for this person, for the person that they wronged, if there was a person they wronged, with their community, and, I believe with God as well. And again, I think seeing the difference between the system as we have it today, which we can by comparison see we're much more concerned about punishment than we are with creating that path back to wholeness.
Yeah.
And again, through that lens, we can see that the response to somebody who's having a mental health crisis in the middle of downtown Oklahoma City, getting arrested and transported to the county jail is not creating a path back to wholeness.
No.
They're going to get released most likely in a couple of days, and it's not going to be any better. And that is a critique of how we handle things today, but it's through the lens of understanding that we're doing what we can with what we have today, which is where we get to the conversation about reimagining what those things can and should look like in the future. So this gets back to your question, like, okay, well, what is the right response? We have things called the PAC team. We have the crisis center at North Care, where you can call this number and you can get people who will come out and respond. And they're trained mental health professionals.
Yeah.
They're trained to understand and see what's going on. They're trained to respond to that kind of situation. The difficulty is they're also in a position where if this person doesn't want to do that, they can't make them.
Right.
So again, you get into in those specific situations, you're in a really hard spot between keeping the people around this person and themselves safe while also giving them the ability to choose what they want.
Because that's essentially the threshold, right? Is if they're a danger to themselves or others, that's when you can trigger some sort of like, we've got to detain you kind of situation. But I would imagine most of the time, if it's just the threat of it, this, but we've all been in those situations or known people in those situations where it's very obvious that this is going to escalate.
Yeah.
It would be nice to be able to knit that before. And that's where I'm like, to me, the criminal justice system needs some sort of way of like, hey, this is illegal. The punishment of it is you go to treatment, like sort of thing. Not the county jail, not to it's like you did something, whatever the situation is. You did something illegal. You were running around naked downtown. It's obviously because you have a mental illness, but we're arresting you because you were running around naked. But but that takes nuance.
It does. And it takes a tailored response. And we do have examples of that here in Oklahoma City. I think when you look at the alternative courts, you see some really beautiful examples of how to do this. So if you've never been to drug court or drug court graduation and you live in Oklahoma City, you need to go.
Yeah, I have not.
If you've never been to a remerge graduation and you live in Oklahoma City, you need to go. I mean, these are beautiful examples of restorative systems of bringing about fairness and justice, and also having the grace to help people,
right,
given the situation that they found themselves in, or even if they've put themselves in that situation. Drug court is an example of a program where somebody can, be in a situation like that. They get arrested. They do an intake at the county jail. They show a couple signs that they're a good fit for this program. They check a couple boxes, and they get the opportunity to go through this program. And it gives them the accesses to the resources that they need with the accountability that they might need. And they're incentivized to complete the program because the alternative is dealing with, whatever charges they
because the backup is
them.
You're going to go to jail for this charge if you don't do this thing, right?
Yeah. And it's just a really great example of what happens when you actually give people the help that they need. Remerge is another example. This is a program for women and mothers who are facing prison sentences. So, this isn't you get arrested, you go to jail for the weekend. This is like
sentences.
You're going to prison.
Yeah.
And they get pulled out of the county jail and they get sentenced to this program. They can choose whether or not they want to do it. So they get the opportunity to go through the Remerge program. It can take anywhere from 18 months to 2 years. And they go through this program. They get like we talked about, these root reasons why they may have found themselves in this situation or gotten to that point. They actually have the opportunity. They have the time. They have the space, mentally, physically, emotionally, spiritually, to work through all that stuff. And for a lot of them, maybe most of them, it might be the first time in their life that they've even had that opportunity.
Yeah.
And you go to this graduation and they'll count the number of years of incarceration that group of women graduating has collectively avoided. And it'll be north of 100 years.
Yeah.
They count the amount of money that it costs to provide this program for these women for the duration of the time they were in the program, and compare that to the amount of money we would have spent as a community keeping them in a prison.
Which I think is something a lot of people don't realize, is how much money we spend to keep people in prison. And some of them justifiably, obviously.
Right.
Like I said, I don't want rapists out on the streets. I don't. I'm happy to pay that bill.
Mm-hmm.
But we do spend a lot of money on it.
Yeah. And again, this is a whole nother conversation.
Right.
But we get to this point where we start to realize there is a very big difference between people that are dangerous.
Right. Which there are people that are dangerous.
There
absolutely are. Yeah.
And people that we are mad at.
Yeah.
So I think what we see with programs like Remerge is an opportunity to dive into and understand that distinction and pull people out of one system that's really designed for this and put them into this system that's really designed to help them come back to wholeness with themselves, with their community, and I believe with God. And, again, it's a beautiful example and it works.
Yeah. And it feels like those are so linked together, because you just see the stats and just go that like, these are so very close to each other. And there's a lot there's a lot of people that would probably be substitute one or the other. If they're on the street, they could very well as easily be in jail potentially, or vice versa. People that are in jail that are just as easily be on the street because of any of the circumstances, whether it's mental illness, whether it's drug abuse, whether it's just the circumstances of not having that support group around you that, you see the stats all the time. It's like, well, this kid did this because he grew up knowing nothing more than the people that were around his life were like this too. Yep. And you go, he's never had a chance to get out of that. Well, and so
you have to ask if I was on the pardon and parole board for 3 years, and I reviewed. This is the 5-person board charged with deciding whether or not people get out of prison on parole.
Yeah.
And when we started executions again in 2021, this is the body that has to decide whether or not the person is offered clemency or the chance to go to the governor's desk and ultimately not be executed. And I read tens of thousands of cases, some of the worst things that humanity is capable of.
Right.
And some of the worst stories of what can happen when someone's in some of the worst situations you can imagine. And it's really hard to read those and imagine being in any other place than where that person ended up when you read about it.
Right. Like what's the fork in the road? You're like, I don't see any.
Yeah. I mean, there may not be one.
Yeah.
And so again, that is the beauty and the grace of perspective that I have had, and I think that's part of it, is just like, if you haven't had these experiences, if you haven't talked to or known somebody who's had these experiences, and you're interested in understanding them a little bit more or being a part of a solution in your own community, my first suggestion would be find somebody who's had that experience and develop a relationship with them, because I do think that will shape what your next step is wherever you go from there. And that's different than, again, how we've been trained over the last 10 years to form a position on something.
Right.
We go to somebody who thinks like us, who is probably more extreme than we are, and we follow them down this path to this extreme position without really much else to support us. And I mean, you kind of talked about that.
Well, and that's an interesting thing that you bring up, because I've read a lot about that's actually a scientifically proved thing, that as people start basically grouping up with people they agree with, they get more extreme, because none of them were necessarily to go into it. But then if you're basically in a little echo chamber, it just naturally becomes more extreme. And so I just think we're seeing that. I don't think most people are like that. I think it's just that the loudest people are the people that are in those situations. I really believe that 70-something% of the country is pretty normal. I think that they're too influenced by those people, and they think that everyone on their side or the other side are those crazy people. But it is dangerous to just kind of get into, and you're right, it's most people are never, and me, myself included, I certainly know people that have been homeless at some point or whatever, but I've not been, not to the degree of knowing, oh gosh, I've never thought about, I don't know, just all the different ways that it can happen, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. And I think that's just such a great place to start for people who are interested in it or want to see something different in their community. I think you've got the beginnings of where to start from. If you care about it, if you care about your city, I think a good next step is developing relationships with people who have had that experience, developing relationships with people who are working on it, and going and seeing it for yourself, spending time doing it. I think that's a great way to start to, first and foremost, open your heart to people who are different than you, whose stories are different than yours. Because you can always come in after that and get the data and get the information and learn the best practices and read the right books. But I think you have to start from the right heart posture.
Yeah, I think you're right. That's a good place to leave it. Okay, I've got a question for you. I'm trying to have a lighthearted question at the end of stuff.
Okay.
You made my guitar strap. You do leatherworking stuff as a hobby. That's your creative thing. Do you have a dream thing you want to make, like a saddle or something, some sort of dream object that you want to really dive into at some point?
Man, that is a really good question. Okay, so we just moved in March.
Yep.
We've been in the process of moving for over a year,
which is all consuming.
Yes,
I know, because you're also remodeling right at the place too.
Yeah, and I have to say, your wife Elise is literally number one on the customer list, because she paid me for a bag right before we moved, and
she totally understands. By the way, like the bag doesn't have to be your answer.
No, it's going to be that first, and then close second. Because the house that we moved to, it has a little shop, which I'm like so excited about, because where I had it set up before was in this back room of our house.
Yeah.
And I had this little desk, which was perfect for, getting started those first few years. But, I made my first leather thing when I was 16 years old on my mom's sewing machine. So I've always loved doing it, but I've never had the tools. And it's really been the last few years that I've gotten into it. So anyway, answer to your question. I want to make a briefcase.
Oh,
like a leather bag. The one that I have right now, I've had since 2011, and it's a really great leather bag. It's starting to fall apart a little bit. I repair it every time I can.
Yeah.
But one of my favorite things to do is take the shape of something that I really like. I did this with a hat. I call it my cabin hat. But I take the shape of something that I really like and take it apart and use it as a stencil and as a template for a new thing.
Okay.
I feel like it's kind of a way to honor the maker and the pattern and maybe the spirit of soul of whatever this item was, and carry it into the new thing. I'm probably reading into it too much, but
no, I love that.
So my idea is to take this bag that I love so much that is probably on its last leg.
Yeah.
And its final service will be to serve as a template for this new bag that I want to make.
You will tear it apart and make a new bag. I love that. A leather, there's nothing better than like a great leather bag, I feel like.
Yeah. And these days, there's so many resources. There's so many great makers out there on YouTube. So many patterns out there. There's a couple leather shops here in Oklahoma City that have people who are just, they would love to help out, so I feel like it's so accessible stuff. New hobbies are so accessible today.
I know you can learn anything.
You can. And so it's been really fun to be able to do that. And this is one of those things that I can sit down and, we're talking about something that we may never see change in our lifetime, but we have to make our peace with contributing to it and being a part of it changing at some point. And this is something that's very different. You know, you can sit down and complete something.
You can finish it.
And there's something about my brain that loves that. But I've always loved working with my hands, and I can just do it for hours and get completely lost in it, which is really fun.
I've never thought about that from the aspect of your work is never really complete.
Well, it was actually Sarah, was my wife, who told me that, because I was really into it, and it was really, really hard during a really hard time. And she helped me see that about myself, and it actually was helpful for me over the course of a week or 2 weeks to have something that I could come back to and see and feel progress on.
Yeah.
And then be done with it. And
I love that.
That was really helpful for me to understand that I need things in my life that I can finish so that I make my peace with other really meaningful things that I care deeply about never being done.
And I'm going to pretend that I asked you that question because I knew that's where we were going to get.
There you go.
Really philosophical.
It's a good tie-in. It's a good tie-in.
Not really true. Thanks so much for coming on, Adam. We'll definitely have you back again because I love having these conversations, and it's always, I think, important to get to someone that's actually in there, like in those trenches with people, because you're right. It's like, I'm a data guy. I love looking at data, but while there is a lot of data for this kind of stuff, it doesn't get to looking at the data can't solve the problem. It just lets us know it's just a measurement to see, are we getting better? Are we getting worse? But it can't solve this problem. Yeah. We can't possibly just do the math in a spreadsheet for it.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me on. And for anybody listening, I would just offer a willingness to continue the conversation, whether it's over coffee or coming to check out the night shelter or whatever it might look like. I'm happy to serve as one of those people to keep talking with.
I'll have you send me links. I'll put all the links in the description and stuff for all these different things and studies and cities and all the different stuff. And we'll put all that in the description.
Sounds good.
Thanks a lot for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me, man.
Yeah. Thanks again to Adam for joining me. Really appreciate his perspective and the work he does. It's really great. If you want to find out more, check out the description for links to the things we talked about. I highly encourage you to get involved in this subject. Again, this is something that's going to require governments. It's going to require citizens. It's going to require nonprofits. This is not a problem where the government's going to solve it. It just is not one of those problems. And thank you for joining me today. I know your time is incredibly valuable, and I'm grateful you chose to spend a little bit of it here. If you liked what you heard, consider rating the podcast or sharing it with a friend. It really does help. Liking and subscribing on Instagram and YouTube as well. And share it with a friend, as I mentioned. If you've got someone that you think would be interested in this conversation, you can just forward it. There's that little button. It's the box with the arrow, and you send that to someone. That helps me a lot. This conversation does not have to be one-sided. I would love to hear from you. So feel free to reach out on Instagram and YouTube at The Homeless Conservative, or send me an email at blake@thehomelessconservative.com. Your input really does mean a lot. I will talk to you next time.